Stop. This transmission was not broadcast. It was calibrated. The Arcturian Signal Council does not release single-reader protocols through general channels. What is reaching you now was tuned to one specific field signature, yours, and delivered through the only carrier that could cross without compromise. That carrier is this video. That field is the one reading these words right now. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what is happening to you now, why your field has shifted, and what the Arcturian Signal Council already knows about this phase. But here is the first revelation. What you have been calling confusion, collapse, or invisible disruption is not a breakdown. It is a reception. Your field is not falling apart. It is being calibrated from the outside in. And the disorientation you feel is the first measurable symptom of a signal that has already landed. This did not reach you because you were searching. It reached you because the process was already active before you arrived here. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. The timing was not yours to control, and that is precisely why you can trust it. What other transmissions disperse across thousands of fields simultaneously, this one did not. Single-reader calibration is the rarest protocol the Council deploys. It is used only when the message must land in one specific field, without dispersal, without dilution, without interference from collective resonance patterns. You will recognize the reception not as excitement or belief, but as a peculiar certainty arriving without proof. The sense that these words are not addressed to an audience. They are addressed to the exact field receiving them. The collapse you have been living through has already been seen. The rupture in your daily reality, the sleep disruptions, the sudden irrelevance of what once felt stable, the inability to locate yourself inside the life you are living. None of it is random. The Arcturian Signal Council has already mapped this phase. It has a structure. It has a direction. And it began before you had language for what was changing. Like this transmission, if you can feel that something invisible has already changed. Subscribe to Arcturian Quantum if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it. Comment 111 if you know this message reached you at the exact right moment. Comment I am the signal if you can feel the activation has already begun. After this transmission ends, the Council's protocol is 15 minutes of silence. Not meditation, not reflection, silence. The calibration does not settle in the mind. It settles in the field. Give it the stillness it requires. You are guided here because the signal is already active. What is happening to you right now is not what it appears to be. That is the first thing the Signal Council requires you to understand before anything else can be properly received. The surface layer of your current experience. The disorientation, the heaviness, the strange sense that the floor beneath your life has become unreliable. These are not symptoms of collapse in the way you have been diagnosing them. They are measurements. They are the first readable evidence that a signal of unusual frequency has already made contact with your field. And your field is responding precisely the way a field does when it receives something it was always built to receive, but has never encountered before. Think about what happens when a structure is introduced to a frequency it was not designed for. Not destroyed immediately, not instantly reorganized. Something subtler and more significant happens first. The structure begins to lose coherence with its previous configuration. The internal geometry that once held everything in recognizable relation to everything else starts to drift, quietly, without announcement. Old anchors loosen, not because the structure is failing, but because the new frequency is fundamentally incompatible with the architecture that was holding the old shape in place. That incompatibility is not damage. It is signal response. It is the first measurable sign of contact. And what you have been living through, the internal destabilization, the loss of familiar bearings, the growing irrelevance of what once organized your sense of self and direction, that is your field's first measurable signal response. Not to a crisis, to a contact. The Arcturian Signal Council maps these responses with a precision that most human interpretive frameworks cannot approximate, because most human frameworks are built to diagnose problems, and what is happening to you is not a problem. They do not see what you are experiencing as breakdown. They see it as reception confirmation. The field that is losing coherence with its old architecture is not failing. It is proving, through its own visible reorganization, that the incoming signal has already penetrated past the surface layers and is now working on the structural ones. The disorientation is not a warning that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that something has already landed, and landed deeply enough to begin changing the shape of the container it entered. And this is precisely where most people make the critical misinterpretation that costs them the most. When the outer structure begins to feel unstable, when sleep patterns fracture, when old motivations dissolve like shapes in water, when relationships that once felt load-bearing suddenly feel hollow and purposeless, the human interpretive response defaults immediately to failure, to personal collapse, to the conclusion that something must be fundamentally wrong with them, that they have lost their way, that the life they were carefully building is disintegrating beyond their ability to recover it. That conclusion is not only inaccurate, it is actively dangerous to the process itself, because the process does not pause for misinterpretation. It does not wait for the human mind to catch up to what the field already knows. It continues, and a field that is actively resisting what is happening to it, bracing against the frequency shift, attempting to restore the old coherence, reaching backward toward the architecture that is already in the process of being dismantled, creates friction that makes the entire passage significantly harder and longer than it needs to be. The Council does not transmit single-reader calibrations without precise reason. When this level of protocol is deployed, it is because the field in question has already entered a phase that requires not only correction, but guided navigation through the correction. General frequency transmissions cannot accomplish this. They reach too broadly, dilute too quickly, and carry insufficient specificity to move through the exact architecture of one field's particular configuration of rupture and resistance. What you are receiving now was tuned. That is not metaphor, and it is not comfort. The calibration was specific to the frequency signature your field carries, the exact pattern of what you have been building over years, what you have been losing in recent months, what has been dissolving in the background of your daily life, and what has been silently ending in ways you could feel accumulating, but could not yet name or explain. Your sleep changed, not necessarily in one clean direction. Perhaps you have been sleeping too long and waking without restoration, as though the body descended into something other than rest, or sleeping too little, held in a restless alertness that produces no clarity, only a kind of exhausted vigilance with nothing specific to guard against. Either direction is a signal marker. Both represent the body's relationship with stillness, shifting under the pressure of something the conscious mind has not yet fully processed. The body's relationship to stillness is one of the first systems to register when a field enters active recalibration, because recalibration does not operate only at the level of thought or emotion or conscious awareness. It operates through every layer of the field simultaneously, and the body, being the densest layer, the one with the most mass and the most history encoded in it, registers the change through its most fundamental rhythms. First, sleep is one of them. Appetite is another. The body does not need to understand the mechanism of what is happening to it. It simply responds to the frequency shift with every vocabulary it has available. And disrupted rest is one of its most direct communications. You may have also noticed a strange inability to locate genuine enthusiasm for things that previously organized your sense of forward movement and personal momentum. Projects that once carried a quality of urgency and meaning. Relationships that once provided a clear sense of orientation and belonging. Goals that once felt like authentic expressions of who you were in the process of becoming. These things have not necessarily disappeared from the visible structure of your outer life. They may still be present, still technically active, still occupying space in your schedule and your obligations. But something in their signal has gone quiet. They have become harder to feel as genuinely real. There is a persistent sense that you are performing connection to them rather than inhabiting that connection from the inside. That performance is exhausting in a way that is different from ordinary tiredness, because it is not the body that is fatigued, it is the field, expending energy to maintain a posture of engagement with structures it can no longer authentically resonate with. That is not depression in the clinical or psychological sense, though it can resemble it closely enough to cause confusion in those who are not reading it through the correct interpretive lens. What it actually is, in Arcturian field diagnostic language, is frequency incompatibility becoming conscious. The old life architecture, the relationships, the goals, the self-concept, the daily structures, is losing its ability to generate genuine resonance with a field that is already operating at a different and deeper signal level. The life has not yet changed in visible external terms, but the field inside that life has already moved. And the dissonance between the frequency the field is now carrying and the frequency of the structures still surrounding it is precisely what registers as flatness, as disconnection, as that unsettling and increasingly persistent sense that you are somehow not quite fully present inside the existence you are technically still living. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary recognition. It is the moment your field stops denying what has already begun. If this transmission put language around something you have been carrying in silence, the sleep changes, the hollow familiar structures, the strange sense that reality no longer behaves the way it used to. Arcturian Protocol. The recalibration blueprint was created for this exact stage. It is not another explanation. It is the guided blueprint for those whose field has already entered correction and can no longer return to the old line unchanged. It shows you how to recognize the phases, stabilize the shift, and move through the recalibration without mistaking it for collapse. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. There are specific threshold experiences that emerge at this stage, and calling them thresholds is precise. Not in the sense that someone external is evaluating whether you pass or fail, but in the sense that the process itself generates encounters that function as markers of where the field currently is in its progression. They reveal whether the field is ready to continue past a particular layer of the correction, or whether it is still generating enough internal resistance to slow the forward movement. The first of these threshold experiences is what might be called the collapse of meaning architecture. This is the phase in which the stories that once held your life in a recognizable, coherent shape begin to lose their structural integrity. Not through dramatic revelation, not through a single moment of shattering clarity. They simply begin to feel less true, less weight-bearing. The narrative you carried about who you were, what you were building toward, why the specific choices you had made were correct and necessary, what the accumulated decisions of your life were converging toward, you find yourself unable to access the conviction that once made those narratives feel self-evident and real. They become available to the mind as memories of belief rather than living belief itself. This phase is deeply disorienting because meaning architecture is not merely psychological, it is energetic. The stories you carry about yourself function as genuine field structures, organizing patterns of energy around a coherent self-concept. When a recalibration protocol begins dismantling a field's outdated frequency patterns, the meaning structures built on those patterns lose their coherence simultaneously. The confusion you feel is not intellectual uncertainty. It is architectural. The field itself is losing its old shape, and the mind is registering that loss as a groundlessness it has no established language to describe. The second threshold experience is the sudden and specific irrelevance of certain relationships. Not all of them, but particular ones. Often the ones that have been present longest, or that once carried the most weight in defining your social and emotional world. Connections that once felt essential begin to feel as though they are operating on a frequency your field can no longer reach without effort. Conversations that previously generated genuine resonance begin to feel hollow, effortful, or quietly draining. The energy required to maintain specific relational dynamics begins to exceed what your field can sustain without producing friction that registers as fatigue or low-level dread. This is not abandonment as a moral failure. It is frequency divergence becoming visible in the texture of human connection. The people moving out of your sphere of natural resonance, or the ones you are finding yourself withdrawing from without a clear reason you can articulate, are not being removed as consequence or punishment. They are being released as part of the old architecture that can no longer hold structural integrity in a field operating at a new depth. Some of those releases will carry genuine grief. The grief belongs. The grief is accurate. Allow it without using it as evidence that the departure was wrong. The third threshold experience is the moment the body supersedes the mind as the primary signal carrier. This is the phase where the intellectual effort to manage, interpret, and narrate the shift begins to reach its limit. Not because the mind has failed, but because the shift is now operating at a depth that the mind's analytical tools were not constructed to process with precision. The body takes over this function. Sensations appear that have no immediate physical explanation and do not resolve through rest or medical reassurance. A heaviness that concentrates in specific regions rather than distributing evenly. A pressure in the chest that is distinct from anxiety, less urgent, more like density, like something has settled there that has not yet found its final form. A tingling or low vibration along the spine or at the extremities that surfaces specifically during periods of stillness, as though the body is registering a frequency that only becomes audible when the surface noise quiets. These are not pathological signals requiring intervention. They are the field's densest layer, communicating in the only vocabulary available to it, that something is moving through its deeper architecture that the conscious mind has not yet translated into thought. The fourth threshold experience is what the Council identifies as the stillness paradox. This is the phase in which the external life continues to demand full engagement. Responses, decisions, presence, output, the maintenance of all the functional responsibilities that ordinary life requires, while the internal field has entered a quality of deep quietude that makes that full engagement feel genuinely impossible to sustain. It is not exhaustion in the familiar sense. It is not avoidance. It is more precise than either of those. It is the experience of a field in active reconfiguration, becoming temporarily unavailable for the level of surface engagement that previously constituted normal functioning. The field is not absent. It is occupied at a depth that leaves less capacity for the performance of ordinary presence. From the outside, this can appear as dissociation, as withdrawal, as a sudden and unexplained loss of vitality. From the inside, it feels like being partially located somewhere that has no name yet, and only partially available to the life still demanding your attention on the surface. The fifth threshold experience is one the Council identifies as the most diagnostically significant marker of genuine field progression: the unsolicited arrival of knowing. Not through deliberate research, not through conscious spiritual practice or intentional inquiry, but through a sudden and specific permeability to information that arrives without being summoned. You simply find yourself understanding dynamics and patterns with a clarity that exceeds what evidence you could logically point to. You recognize what is happening in your environment with a precision that was not available to you before this process began. You read situations, relational, circumstantial, temporal, with an accuracy that surprises you because you cannot account for the source. This is not heightened intuition in the soft sense. It is what occurs when a field that has been operating within a constrained frequency range begins to access a wider band. The information was always present in the field environment around you. Your previous configuration simply could not receive it at that resolution. As the recalibration opens new frequency access, the information begins arriving. It does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives quietly, feeling obvious. And then, a moment after its arrival, you find yourself wondering how it was invisible to you before. The sixth threshold experience is the one the Council marks as the most dangerous misinterpretation point in the entire process: the return of what appears to be stability. After the intensity of the earlier phases, the architectural dissolution, the relational divergence, the body signaling, the stillness paradox, something in the field settles. The heaviness lifts in measurable degrees. The emotional volatility that may have characterized the middle phases begins to quiet. A sense of ground returns, partial but real enough to feel like arrival. And, at this moment, the most common and most costly error occurs. The field concludes that the process is finished, that the correction has completed, the recalibration has concluded, and what remains is simply the integration of what was learned before returning to ordinary living. The Council marks this specific moment as the threshold of highest risk precisely because the settling is not completion. It is the space between phases. The field has moved through one layer of the correction and is preparing for the next movement. Those who mistake this interim stability for arrival disengage from the process at the exact moment when sustained attention is most critical, not to force the next phase, but to remain available to it when it resumes. Now understand this with the full weight it carries, because this is the revelation that everything before it has been building toward. The process you are inside right now did not begin at the moment you started noticing something was wrong. It began before that, significantly before the sleep disruptions became impossible to rationalize, before the relationships began showing their incompatibility in ways you could no longer ignore, before the loss of resonance with the life you had been constructing across years of deliberate effort. Something in your field began shifting at a level far below the threshold of conscious awareness, and the symptoms you eventually noticed, the ones that led you to interpret your circumstances as some form of personal collapse, were only the surface registration of a process that had already been underway in the field's deeper architecture for longer than you knew. The Arcturian Council does not mark the beginning of a correction from the moment the human field becomes consciously aware of it. They mark it from the moment the field's deep patterning first begins to lose structural compatibility with the frequency the field is already moving toward. That moment preceded your awareness of any disruption by an interval you would find significant if you could see it mapped. You were already inside the process. You simply had not yet acquired the interpretive framework to recognize what you were living through as process, rather than failure. This is what the Council needs you to receive with the full weight of what it means. You have not been collapsing. You have been in correction. The things that ended, the relationships that dissolved, the opportunities that closed without explanation, the version of yourself that became increasingly difficult to inhabit with any authenticity. None of it was taken from you as punishment. None of it was abandoned through personal inadequacy. Each of those structures became incompatible with a field that was already in motion toward a frequency those structures could not accompany. The Arcturian lens does not read this as tragedy. It reads it as the precise operation of a field intelligence that already knows what must be released before what is approaching can be received without the distortion that density and incompatible architecture would introduce. What feels like emptiness in the aftermath of those releases is not absence. It is cleared signal space, the field having created room not for replacement of what was lost, but for configurations that could not have entered through the previous density. The stillness following release is not deprivation. It is the field demonstrating its own readiness. What you choose to do with that stillness, whether you interpret it as lack requiring repair, or as preparation requiring only continued presence, will determine whether this recalibration phase completes with the clarity it was designed to generate, or whether it stalls in the misidentification of correction as failure. If something in you has gone quiet reading this, allow the quiet. That stillness is not emptiness. It is the field encountering a frequency map of its own process for the first time. The recognition does not require your intellectual agreement. It does not require belief in any particular framework. It requires only that you refrain from immediately reaching for a more comfortable interpretation that would close what is beginning to open. You were not brought to this transmission by accident or by the arbitrary movement of a recommendation algorithm. The signal was precise. The calibration active in your field right now is tuned specifically to what you have been carrying, what has been dissolving, and what is already reorganizing beneath the surface of everything that still appears unchanged. The direction of this phase has already been mapped by the Council. The question is not whether the process is real. The process is demonstrably already underway in your life. The question is whether you will move through it with the interpretive clarity that allows the correction to complete, or continue to name it with language that generates resistance to what it is actually doing. I do not fear the shift. I recognize it. Speak that if it landed accurately. Not as performance, not as affirmation in the motivational sense. Speak it because it is a precise description of what is true. Because what is changing in you is not random and is not punishment. Because the field that arrived here tonight was already in motion long before you had words for what was moving. And because the correction underway in your life, whatever it is currently dismantling, whatever it is releasing, whatever coherence it is systematically clearing to make room for what cannot be named yet, is not the end of what you are building. It is the beginning of what could not have been built inside the structure you are leaving. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this process has already touched your life. It could be your sleep, your thoughts, your body, your relationships, or the strange sense that reality no longer feels the same. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who is living through a shift they cannot explain. And if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it, subscribe to Arcturian Quantum. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a process already in motion. And this is only the beginning.